But I'll tell you what, let's go ahead and jump on the line with Jacob in Tennessee, who has some insights into gender. Jacob, tell us what's on your mind.
Hi, what's going on? I just want to say, long-time listener. I have been listening to Talk Heathen since back when Eric was the host. I haven't.
Thanks for your support,
Christy. I thought you would be. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. I said thanks for your support, but I won't interrupt again.
Oh, yeah. I've seen you. I haven't seen you, Jimmy. I haven't seen you talk. I've maybe seen like a couple clips with you or a couple like thumbnails with you, Christy. I've heard you talk quite often, and I thought you would be a pretty interesting person to talk with about this. And I'm sure, Jimmy, you've got some things to say as well. And I know this topic has kind of been beat to death. I'm not your ignorant caller, okay? I've been trying to educate myself on this for the past year. And I want to kind of start by asking, like, you and everyone not to assume any negative stuff in the conversation. Like, just give me goodwill. Don't assume I have any bad intentions. Because the main thing I get when I try to discuss this is people instantly, well, why do you care about this topic? And the answer is fairly obvious if you don't assume anything bad about me. The reason is because I have a gender nonconforming family member. And over the past year, I've been kind of educating myself about this more and more. I live outside of Nashville. Right. I actually had a trans boss for about a year. I didn't discuss too many concepts with him, but a few here and there. So I don't have a ton of experience with it. So that's kind of my framing for coming into it. Right. And,
okay. Well, fair enough. Yeah. Let's dive in. What is it that you are playing around with or trying to understand?
Would you agree that you always hear this thing, it's kind of a conflation. You hear gender is assigned at birth, but that's not really true. At least for me,
it is and it isn't. I kind of take your meaning, but we can explore that a little bit. People rarely go home with balloons from the hospital that say it's a female or it has large gametes. They go home and say it's a boy, it's a girl. And, we might think of that as a gendered term rather than a biological term. But honestly, even that notion of biological sex is much more nuanced and complicated. And, it's been said before, so we don't necessarily need to get into every aspect of that. But tell me where this question leads.
Well, it leads to the idea that, you don't want to assign gender at birth because it's not known, right? We assign sex at birth typically, and, you don't want to assign gender because it could, it's not necessarily formed. So I'm
sure.
Coming in
the notion of like raising babies, of letting a child have a non-specific gender identity until they reach an age at which they're able to understand these concepts and express it for themselves, which is not a super commonly held view, but is that sort of the philosophy that you're discussing here?
No, I do understand that though. So reading about this, I can't get a solid mark on when gender is formed, right? At what age is gender solidified in someone's mind? And I've been looking at some of the research, and there's a study on gender non-contentness. I don't know if you've seen this. It's done last year, and it goes. They ask people basically, are you happy with your sex? Do you want to be the opposite sex? A version of that, multiple versions of that, right? And I think it was like 23% of females aged 11 said no, and then at 25 it was 2%, right? Sure. So what I'm trying to figure out is, and I'm coming in with the notion that I don't know when it's formed, and I looked at a lot of, basically I looked to like, well, who's the go-to on this? And I read about the history a little bit. My understanding was Sweden is the go-to. Sweden's been doing this longer than anybody. They're the first people to basically provide medical procedures for trans people. They've been doing it for like 55 years, right? And there's other countries too, like multiple other countries, but like Denmark. You can European studies are pretty interesting because I think the American system is a little polluted by capitalism, right? It's just inherent in the system. Capitalism is going to has forces that play a role in our medical and in the U.S. medical system. It's just inherent in the system.
Yeah.
And you don't get that with a lot of these European countries like Sweden. Sweden considered to have the number one healthcare in the world. And they came out recently, I think it was maybe it was last year. I can look at the date, but they came out and they said that they were basically, what I got from it was that they weren't sure that there was a huge spike in people coming to gender clinics. I think they quoted like 4,000%, specifically female to male was the big hike, and that they were limiting everything in terms of children to therapy, and then everything else was going to be done in like scientific research, like research study setting, not a clinical doctor setting.
Okay, yeah. So we're covering a lot of ground here, and I guess I'm a little bit interested to get to a particular question that we can maybe try to answer or chew on. I will say that if the question is when is gender identity solidified, I would say never. When is your identity solidified? Certainly there are periods at which we see it change a lot quicker. If you were to ask a bunch of 11-year-olds about their relationship with their favorite band or their favorite TV show, and then ask them again a few years later, like there's going to be a lot of identity formation and a lot of changing between, let's say, just 11 and 16. That, of course, is at a population level. That's a very broad sort of statement. But I will say sort of fundamentally, we as humans are always evolving, and our perception of ourselves is always evolving and changing. And that's a lifelong process. I don't know that our gender ever like fully stops evolving in that sense either, even if it does tend to become a lot more solidified as we get through puberty and as we start to form a more broad understanding of ourselves. But where is all this leading? What's the kind of ultimate question or point that you wanted to make here?
I don't know if there's an ultimate point or question. It's a bit of a long conversation, and I was hoping that you could maybe help me find some research that I'm not able to find. I'm sure it's out there, because whenever if you believe trans people have existed throughout history.
Very, very much so. Yeah, of course. Obviously, that concept of transness is a modern lens that we try to apply to historical people, and that can always be very, very messy. I'm not trained as an anthropologist. The philosophy of all of that might be a little bit outside of the scope of our conversation, but the notion of trans identities being tied to aspects of our biology that have been around for as long as we've been human is pretty fundamental, I think, to trans theory in the modern world.
Yeah, I was trying to find some like historical document, because it's not like we have the words to express that idea, right? All throughout history, right? Man, woman, right? That's kind of like the birds and the bees, right? It's what you have to create a child. It's kind of the basis for how the population grows. So it's a very, very fundamental thing. So in terms of like the language, it's always been able, like you've been able to express yourself as I'm a man.
I mean, yes and no. Like even the word gender is something that didn't really enter the English vernacular until the 70s. And it's a term that we sort of stole from linguistics rather than from the social sciences or the biological sciences. So there is a lot of nuance to these kinds of conversations. I will tell you that we certainly did our damnedest when we were doing secular sexuality on this network to interview historians and people who had an understanding of trans histories and why so many of those have been deleted or removed from the archive, but also what we do know to continue to exist. So secular sexuality would be one resource that I might point you towards, though there are certainly many others.
Yeah, yeah. It's harder to find things now. Like you used to be. That's kind of a tangent, but I would be really interested, and I've been trying to digging for like historical, documents. I mean, I don't know how long modern medical records go back, but there has to be something in there at some point, and I'd really love to know what it is. But
Hey, Jacob,
yeah,
Jacob, are you a student?
Sure.
Are you enrolled in school anywhere?
No, not currently. No.
No. All right, because there is a database of historical documents, or just professional writings that you could find. It's called JSTOR. It's JSTOR. And usually, if you have a university or college email, you can access it for free, but otherwise, you'd have to pay for it. But these are documents, works, whether they're books or articles. It's a scholarly journal. This is a database that has millions of different works categorized and ready for your download if you want. So you can take a look at that, and then of course when you look at that, you always want to pay attention to the references in the back. A lot of times you can go to museums and access archives and things like that. So I mean, don't limit yourself. And I don't know how much digging you're doing, but I mean, a Google search or something like that, you really need to kind of go straight to the primary sources, and you can get those through more scholarly avenues that are supported by different university archives and things like that. I don't know if that'll help, but if you write down JSTOR and go look at JSTOR, you might find something that talks about transgender identity in early human history.
Sure. And, talking to you guys has given me a couple ideas. I bet I could probably reach out to a professor at a university.
I guarantee that you could. I guarantee. Yeah. So I teach college at two universities up here in the Northeast. I'm an assistant professor, so I'm not a full-fledged professor, no PhD or anything, but I have a lot of access to, to different scholars, and they're like so willing to talk about their craft. If they got an email from you, yeah. I guarantee, maybe not everybody, but I guarantee you'll get an answer, or at least the right path. You'll definitely be put on that. And so it's definitely worth thinking outside the box. But start there, start with the database that I gave you and see what you come up with.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll probably maybe get like a list or I'll try and find multiple professors and send out, an email to maybe 10 of them. I bet you anything I'll get a response. So yeah, and I was trying to understand it historically, and where I'm trying to go with this is, so like I'm conflicted now. You have my perspective. I'm looking at this.
Tell us about that conflict. Yeah, what does it ultimately come down to? That either X is true or Y is true? What's that central concern?
It's what's the best thing for my family member, essentially. And I looking at what Europe has done recently, and looking a little bit at psychology, about basically I've been researching models on how people process information, and at what age you have the capacity to understand multiple complex ideas and compare and contrast them, right? And what I found there is there's Peugeot's cognitive development theory and there's information processing theory. Those were the two main ones. And Peugeot claimed that it's not until about 20 that you're capable of contrasting, basically conflicting complex topics, right? So that kind of leads me to, kind of think in my mind, well, if we have a gender nonconforming kid, gender isn't fluid. And it's just I'm a little confused as to what the best path is, because I'm getting.
I hear that, but I think you may be going a little bit too heady in certain ways, and I don't mean to be at all anti-intellectual about it, but I don't think that like Piaget's theory of cognitive development was ever meant to be applied to providing healthcare access to teenagers. I think that honestly,
What has to do
you
with the
might
idea?
want to center the conversation a little bit more on, all right, what is this person's need? What is their distress? What kinds of struggles are they having, or what kind of pain are they in? And then what kind of potential solutions are on offer? Whether that is in consultation with a medical doctor or with a therapist, like these are the experts that you might want to be consulting, and you don't have to just take their word for it because they're a doctor or because they're an expert. But if they are your treatment provider, your child's treatment provider, then you want to be in conversation with them about what they recommend and why. We have data that is much more grounded in this issue than trying to understand the stories of, Lily Elb receiving a gender confirmation surgery 100 years ago, of, the universal friend being a non-binary historical person in colonial America, is not going to be nearly as relevant to the question of what does my child need in order to thrive as, for instance, all of the data that we have from an organization like the Trevor Project, demonstrating the way that gender acceptance is going to be highly correlated with health and well-being measures like our sleep and suicide rates and diet and exercise. And, there's so many places that you could be looking that aren't so wrapped up in the philosophy of, are trans people real?
And it does not have to do with trans people. Well, it's just, that's what kind of person I am. Like, I start from the bottom and work my way up, and that was a bit of a tangent, right? That's not. Really,
I very much appreciate that. And I don't mean to be anti-intellectual. I very much value these historical documents and stories and things like that. But I'm also a clinician. I'm not a psychological researcher. I'm somebody who reads psychological research and then works to apply that in the day-to-day lives of real people. And if your concern is more about the health and well-being of a real person, then I would encourage you to think more like a clinician than like a architect or engineer.
I'm getting there. It just I got to put all the pieces together. And I really wanted to explain my backstory because people assume so many things when I try and discuss this topic. They assume the worst. I get that for whatever reason, and so I just wanted to kind of start from the ground up with you guys so you understand everything. So nothing was kind of assumed, but so. Where was I going to take this?
Well, I guess I want to say I'm not here to absolve you of your sins. I'm not here to persecute you for them. Whether you're a good person or a bad person, or whether you have the right motivate, those aren't questions that I think are particularly interesting, or that I, as a stranger on the internet, am qualified to try and explore or examine. Let me let you off the hook in that sense, while also inviting you to use the best resources available to offer love and care and support to a vulnerable child in your life.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're a clinician, so you would be a really good person to ask this question to. It's kind of what I was leading to. There's a lot of thoughts kind of going through my head. So do you know about the original, the medical history of how basically a transmedicalization, right? And kind of like, I guess there's like an original, couple people, and then it expands out from that. Do you know much about like the history? Because basically,
I'm certainly not a medical historian by any means. I referenced Lily Elb a moment ago, and I think that that's a interesting story that more people should be aware of. But again, where exactly are we heading with this, and how does it apply to the health and well-being of a real human person in your life today?
So we're going, yeah. Well, I'm trying to get ahead of it because I don't know, because they're gender nonconforming. But so coming from a skeptic, I'm trying to find basically the research that was done in the beginning, where somebody is presenting as wanting to be the opposite sex, and they have instead of having multiple treatments, they have one treatment.
I'm confused. I'm sorry. So Jacob, I'm sorry. Please allow me to step in before I get too confused, and then we build a house of cards, and I have no idea what's going on. But so you're trying to get. This is something I'm confused about. You're trying to get ahead of what? That's A, right? What is it exactly that you're trying to get ahead of? But B, when you talk about, you're conflating sex and gender a little bit, right? Because you're talking about when does gender take hold? When is gender assigned? When do people conform to this identity that they're essentially told that they have? But then you're talking about people who also want to be the. Excuse me. I'm sorry. Say one more time.
I didn't say that I told that. I mean, you're not really told your gender. You're told your sex.
Right. Okay. And now you're talking about people who want to be the opposite sex, but the gender and I think that you are told your gender. I mean,
I think I addressed that in the opening parts of this call. Like, nobody is walking around holding their baby female. They're talking about their baby girl. And that is a meaningful use of gendered language.
But the thing is, though, Jacob, you're trying to get ahead of what exactly? Like, this family member of yours doesn't conform to the gender roles or the gender identities that are largely either man or woman, boy or girl, right? And they don't buy them. So what? The only reason why somebody is considered transgender is because we tell them that there's a such thing as gender, when we don't really know. I mean, you could talk about going back in history and when did this start. We have no idea what early human gender roles were, really. I mean, we have an idea, but how close were men and women, or males and females, at performing the same tasks or at fitting into society? They're probably a lot closer in early human history than they are now, where we tell people what a woman should be doing or what a man should be doing and what is acceptable and what is not. I think that this family member you have has a great deal of courage. I assume, as a young person who is saying, I am not going to accept what I'm told about who I am. I just need to figure it out for myself. And I think to you to ask, well, what's the best thing for this family member? Compassion. Love, right? I really liked when in the beginning of this call you said people want to know why I'm so concerned about it, and I tell them, well, because a member of my family is nonconformist. I think that is a good start to a defense of this person, and I think that you should advertise and highlight that you care about this person and you do want to learn about what they're going through. But I don't think there's anything to get ahead of. I think you need to be there with them for their journey, and just show them support and let them know that they're loved no matter what. And that's what I've been thinking about this whole time. So thank you, Christy, and thank you, Jacob, for letting me get that out.
No, please.
No, absolutely. I mean, you're totally right. But as a father, I can't help but want to dig at the data, dig at the research, look at what the science says. Look at, because this doesn't seem to be a sealed subject in terms of what the appropriate medical process is. So,
I mean, all of that is fair, but let me just ask you this question before we start to look at some of the other calls here. If your child was not struggling with gender dysphoria or with trying to fit their gender into an unaccepting world, but rather was dealing with pancreatic cancer, I would definitely implore you to read up, to learn more about cancer, to have an in-depth understanding of what appropriate treatment plans might be, and to recognize and understand why in some situations, some doctors might recommend one treatment plan and other doctors might recommend a different one, and to try and make informed choices about that treatment plan for and with your child, being supported by their medical team and their other service providers. I would implore you to take the same approach here. It is valuable to try and understand maybe the history of gender dysphoria and whatever that means historically and all of these like complicated ideas. But you don't need to become an expert in oncology to be a good parent to a sick child. And the real goal here is not to understand the history of cancer diagnosis, but to understand the treatment plans that are available to the person that you care about.
And you just put the crux on the whole thing, to a sick child. And that's what that's what, they don't necessarily think they're sick. I don't necessarily think they're sick. Right.
And it's about fitting into a left-handed or a right-handed world as a left-handed person. I certainly don't mean that being trans is a sickness, but I do want to acknowledge that trying to fit in as a gender non-conforming person in a very prescriptive society is going to come along with some pain. And that's without speaking to specifics like gender dysphoria or body dysmorphia and some of these other ideas.
Sure. Yeah, I can tell you, like, living outside of Nashville in somewhat rural America, people around here are very accepting. We had a trans gentleman that was prom king 2 years ago. The community is great around here where I'm at with this stuff. And what I'm trying to get at right now is, like I said, I'm trying to get my hands on the original research where they were doing one thing at a time. Whereas now, if you present to a clinic as transgender, there's multiple procedures they would start, right? You would start.
I don't necessarily know that I would take that summation, but I guess I would just again point out that there is no like one cancer treatment at a time. That there are multiple ways of addressing complex issues. And again, I don't mean to say that transness is a disease the way that cancer is, but I do want you, as you are looking at these like medicalized notions of sex and gender, to really take seriously the idea that we're not asking a simple question of should we or should we not flip this particular switch. You're never going to find the original single treatment flow. And I'd encourage you to look in very different directions. So I want to be respectful towards the other callers that we have on the line. And I hope that I've been able to kind of get through that this is not a singular issue in the way that I feel like maybe you're trying to present it, and that a historical approach, a research approach is not going to be as effective as one that's maybe more clinically driven and that is in coordination with a team of service providers, as well as especially the child that you're concerned about. But with all of that epilogue and all of that other information, Jimmy, anything else that we want to make sure to address before we move on?
Sure. I thought that your metaphor was great. And while being trans is not a sickness, it certainly can feel that way in a world where people are telling you you're sick. Right. Sure. And so it's a struggle. And yeah, just understanding the struggle and helping them along, being there, very important.
I can give you just a quick summation before you let me go. Sure. So right now where I'm at is right there, gender nonconforming. I'm thinking that they might present as trans in a few years. And they don't think they're sick. They've never said anything about wanting to go to the doctor, this or that. But I'm trying to figure out at what point do I step in as a father and maybe take them to the doctor, right? They don't think they want to go, but I think they do. Right. And that's where I'm trying to get to. That's why I'm interested in the original studies where they divide up the studies and they don't do them all at once. And that's where I'm trying to get to. And
so let me just give you this very simple but incredibly important razor, which is the distress principle. If it doesn't hurt, then you likely don't need to do anything to change it. I think that every teenager would probably benefit from talking to a therapist at one point or another, particularly when you are in a vulnerable minority. So however we're defining gender nonconformity, there's going to be some vulnerability to that idea. But what we're looking for is pain. Does something hurt? And if it does, then what can we do about it? But if there isn't pain, if there isn't distress, if there isn't a lot of sleepless nights, or, every teenager is going to struggle. But if those struggles feel like they are all headed in a healthy direction and nothing is overwhelming, it can still be beneficial to talk to a mental health clinician or some other form of therapist. But that would be what I would encourage you to look for is anybody in pain? Is there any hurt here? What's the distress like?
Sure. Yeah. And, I'll let you guys get the other callers. I was hoping we could get to some of the studies where they talk about like the individual treatments, and before they get to them, I was hoping to maybe dig them up and call back and go a little bit further with this.
Those are such broad questions and broad ideas. But if you would like to continue the conversation, by all means, shoot me an email. I'd love to hear from you. Host at atheist-community.org. They'll make sure to get that information to me, or I apologize, TV at atheist-community.org, where you can reach me and we can continue this conversation in one form or another. And I do hope to speak to you again about it.
Okay.